911, what's the address of the emergency?
Yeah, I don't know the secret address. My mom attacked me from EMS now. She's bleeding out. Please help. My mom's bleeding out. I can't get her up. I need to get her to the hospital.
Okay.
Or with someone.
We're going to send an ambulance.
She doesn't have time. She needs to go now.
She thinks that I'm, like, psychotic, like, literally psychopath, sociopath, something like that. She thinks I'm going to kill her.
She said, "Let go of my hair. You're hurting me." He opened the door and pulled her in.
I'm not a psychopath. I'm not this murderer. I'm just trying to peacefully leave or peacefully coexist.
There comes a certain point, ladies and gentlemen, where that last drop of blood came out of her, and she died and left this earth knowing that her son butchered her.
This is a very tragic story. Make sure that you watch to the end. It was a warm September morning in Polk County, Florida. The sun had barely risen when a frantic 911 call came through dispatch. On the other end of the line was a teenage boy, panicked, trembling, his words tumbling out in confusion. "My mom, she fell on the knife." When first responders arrived at the quiet home on Metz Road, they were met with a scene that would haunt even the most seasoned officers. On the kitchen floor lay 39-year-old Catherine Griffith, motionless, blood pooling beneath her head and neck. Kneeling nearby was her 17-year-old son, Colin Griffith, his hands shaking, his voice barely audible. He told officers his mother had been arguing with him when she suddenly fell, right onto a knife. But almost immediately, investigators knew something was wrong. Colin Griffith wasn't just any teenager. His name was already familiar to law enforcement, and for a deeply unsettling reason. 2 years earlier, at just 15, Colin had shot and killed his father, Chuck Griffith, in Oklahoma. At the time, he told police it was self-defense, that his father had attacked him with a knife, and he had no choice but to pull the trigger. The story made local headlines but eventually faded from public view when the shooting was ruled justified. But to those who knew the Griffith family, that tragedy marked only the beginning of a much darker cycle. After his father's death, Colin moved to Florida to live with his mother, Catherine, a woman he barely knew. She had divorced Chuck years earlier after a stormy and abusive marriage. Now, she was determined to rebuild a relationship with her son. It should have been a new beginning. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. At first, neighbors saw nothing unusual about the Griffiths. Catherine worked hard as a nurse. Colin enrolled in school, tried to make friends, and appeared quiet but polite. But behind the walls of their home, tension was already building. Catherine was strict. Some said too strict. She imposed rules, grounded her son frequently, and took away his phone or car when he disobeyed. To her, it was discipline. To Colin, it was control. He felt trapped, angry, resentful, and convinced that his mother didn't understand him. Friends later told investigators that Colin often complained about his mom, calling her crazy and toxic. He claimed she humiliated him, making him do push-ups as punishment, or publicly lecturing him over minor mistakes. But to others, Catherine was simply trying to save her troubled son. She knew he was fragile. He had already endured the trauma of killing his father, an act that, even if in self-defense, would scar anyone for life. She had seen him spiral emotionally, lash out, and lose control. And she feared what he might do next. The warning signs were everywhere. Police were called to the Griffith home multiple times for domestic disturbances. In November of 2023, Colin was arrested for domestic battery after allegedly assaulting his mother during an argument. During his time in juvenile detention, Colin told a jail officer something chilling. "If you send me back to that house, I'll probably kill her." It wasn't a figure of speech. It was a direct threat, one that would later echo through every courtroom and headline. Despite the red flags, Colin was released. He was briefly held under the Baker Act, a Florida law allowing involuntary psychiatric evaluation, but it didn't last long. He was soon back home, with his mother. The cycle continued. By the fall of 2024, things had reached a boiling point. Catherine had decided she was done. She told friends she planned to cut off Colin's phone, sell his car, and withdraw him from school. In text messages, she vented her frustration, saying she couldn't control him anymore and was afraid of what he might do. She hoped tough love might finally make him take responsibility. But for Colin, it felt like betrayal. When his mother drove to his grandmother's house that September morning to pick him up, Colin was already seething. The argument started in the car and continued into the kitchen. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting, then silence. When police arrived, Catherine was gone. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you more real-life crime stories every week. Paramedics pronounced Catherine Griffith dead at the scene. Her wound, a deep slash across the neck, was unlike anything caused by a fall. The medical examiner determined that the knife had severed her trachea, esophagus, and carotid artery. The report was clear: this was no accident. As investigators combed the house, they found blood spatter patterns inconsistent with Colin's story. The knife had been driven with deliberate force, downward and across, suggesting a struggle. When detectives confronted Colin, his responses were inconsistent. At times, he said he tried to help his mother. Other times, he said she attacked him first. Eventually, he stopped talking altogether. He invoked his right to remain silent. But his silence spoke volumes. It was a peaceful neighborhood on the outskirts of Farmington Hills, Michigan. The kind of place where the loudest sound at night was the soft hum of distant traffic or the wind brushing against maple trees. But on that cold October evening, silence was shattered in a way no one could ever forget. When police arrived at the Griffith home, they were met with a scene that would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. The door was slightly ajar, the air thick with a metallic scent of blood. In the living room, 26-year-old Colin Griffith sat motionless, his hands trembling, eyes distant. Nearby, his 62-year-old mother, Catherine, lay lifeless on the floor. To the outside world, Catherine was a gentle, caring woman. She had spent decades building a good life for herself and her family, known by neighbors for her kindness, her calm voice, and her deep devotion to her only son. But in the final moments of her life, all that peace dissolved in a horrifying act no one could have predicted. Detectives began piecing together what happened that night. Colin was taken into custody without resistance. His demeanor was eerily calm, almost detached. One officer would later recall, it was like he wasn't really there. Like something inside him had shut off. The questions began immediately. Why would a son turn on his own mother? Was it sudden rage, a mental breakdown, or something darker, something that had been building for years? But before investigators could get to those answers, they had to deal with the physical evidence. The crime scene told a grim story. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. No struggle in the home beyond the fatal confrontation itself. It was clear, this was no random act of violence. This was something deeply personal. As detectives examined the house, they found signs of a quiet domestic life, framed photos on the mantel, a dining table set neatly for two, and a calendar on the wall marking a doctor's appointment that Catherine would never attend. For those who knew them, Catherine and Colin had always seemed close. She had raised him alone after his father's passing, and friends said she doted on him endlessly. He was her whole world, one neighbor said. She talked about him like he was her pride and joy. But beneath the surface, police would soon uncover a history of tension. Financial stress. Mental health struggles. A growing pattern of unpredictable behavior that Catherine had tried to manage quietly. As detectives interviewed relatives, a clearer picture began to emerge. Colin had reportedly been dealing with anxiety and depression for years, but things had worsened recently. He'd lost his job, withdrawn from friends, and had frequent arguments with his mother about his future. One relative recalled a disturbing conversation just weeks before the tragedy. Catherine had expressed fear, not of strangers, but of her own son. She told me Colin had been talking to himself lately, the relative said. She didn't want to believe he'd ever hurt her, but something in her tone, it sounded like she was worried. Still, no one believed it could come to this. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep telling these important stories and uncovering the truth behind the crimes that shock entire communities. Police began retracing Colin's steps in the hours leading up to the murder. Surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store showed him buying a drink and pacing nervously outside before heading home that evening. His phone records revealed frantic Google searches about mental breakdowns and how to control anger. By midnight, something inside him seemed to snap. Investigators theorized that a heated argument escalated into violence. There were reports of raised voices, a crash, and then silence. The fatal injuries indicated rage, not premeditation, though prosecutors would later argue that Colin had shown clear intent. Still, the evidence of his mental state complicated everything. He claimed not to remember what happened. He told police, "I think I blacked out. I didn't mean to hurt her." As the investigation deepened, the courtroom would later become the stage for a heartbreaking story of love, pain, and irreversible loss. Catherine's friends attended the hearings in disbelief. Some couldn't bring themselves to look at Colin. Others wept as prosecutors detailed the brutality of his actions. The boy they'd watched grow up in their neighborhood was now the man responsible for his own mother's death. But in that courtroom, another question loomed larger than guilt. Could mental illness ever explain such a horrific act? As the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Family, friends, reporters, all drawn to the haunting question of why. Why would a young man take the life of the very person who had given him everything? The prosecution's argument was straightforward. This was murder, not madness. They painted Colin Griffith as a man who had grown resentful of his mother's control, angry about his situation, and unwilling to accept help. They showed text messages between Colin and Catherine, messages that revealed rising tension in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. One text from Catherine read, "You need to get help, Colin. I can't keep living like this." His reply was chilling, "You're always against me. You never listen." For the jury, those words carried weight. They spoke of a relationship unraveling, of love twisted by frustration and despair. But Colin's defense told a very different story. They described a young man suffering from untreated mental illness, someone who had slipped through the cracks of a system meant to protect him. His attorney spoke softly as he addressed the court. Colin Griffith did not act out of hatred. He acted out of confusion, fear, and a fractured mind. What happened that night was a tragedy, but it was not murder born of intent. To support that claim, a psychologist testified that Colin had been showing signs of severe psychosis and paranoia. He'd been hearing voices. He believed his mother was plotting against him. And on that fateful night, those delusions may have reached their breaking point. As the evidence unfolded, the courtroom was divided. Some saw a monster. Others saw a victim of his own mind. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more real-life stories like this one to light. When Colin took the stand, the atmosphere changed. Dressed in a plain gray suit, his voice was quiet, almost childlike. He wept as he spoke about his mother. "She loved me," he said, his voice trembling. "She always did. I don't remember what happened. I just remember her face before everything went dark." There was silence in the courtroom, the kind of silence that only comes from shared disbelief. Even the prosecutor paused for a moment before cross-examining. Then came the brutal reminder: love didn't erase what had been done. Catherine was gone. The woman who had devoted her life to her son had met her end at his hands. After weeks of emotional testimony, the jury withdrew to deliberate. The tension was unbearable. Reporters waited outside, family members prayed quietly, and Colin sat with his head down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Hours passed. Then the jury returned. The verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. A cry broke out from the back of the courtroom, a relative of Catherine's. The sound echoed as Colin closed his eyes, tears falling silently down his face. The judge, voice steady but heavy with emotion, sentenced him to between 20 and 40 years in prison. In his final statement before sentencing, the judge said something that lingered in everyone's mind. This was not a case of evil, but of tragedy. A family destroyed, a mother gone, and a son who will live the rest of his life knowing what he's done. Catherine's funeral was held a week later. Friends and neighbors gathered to remember the woman who had spent her life helping others, the mother whose greatest joy had been her only child. Her photo, framed in white roses, sat at the altar. Those who knew her said she'd spent her last years worrying about Colin, trying to help him find peace. In the end, that love cost her everything. After the service, one of Catherine's friends spoke to a reporter. Her voice cracked as she said, "She never stopped believing in him. Even when things got bad, she kept saying, 'He's my son. I have to help him. She didn't deserve this.'" In prison, Colin reportedly spends his days in quiet isolation. He receives medication for his mental health and rarely speaks to anyone. In a letter sent months after his sentencing, he wrote to a family member, "I wish I could take it all back. I wish I could hug her again. I see her in my dreams. She forgives me there. I just hope someday I can forgive myself." It's a haunting reminder that behind every headline, there's a human story, one filled with love, pain, and the irreversible choices that change lives forever. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next true crime documentary. And remember, behind every case we cover, there are real people, real families, and real consequences. This is the story of Colin and Catherine Griffith, a story of love, loss, and the tragedy that no one saw coming.